Thank you very much, Alan. So, hello again. As most of you know, I'm Meg from the Constitution Unit, and I hope you've enjoyed this morning's deliberations, this weekend's deliberations so far. I've been asked to come back, as Alan said, to talk to you about the first two possible constraints on what a government can do. First, A, that decisions should have to be publicly explained and justified. And second, B, that there should be space for public comment and criticism of changes before they happen. These two kinds of constraints are closely related, and both are things that take place in Parliament, though not just in Parliament, also through the media and other forms of public exposure. It's very easy to make the case that both of these things are essential in a well-functioning democracy, and I'll mostly talk about why you might consider them a good idea. But the story's never straightforward. Some of the kinds of constraints on this list, all of which look pretty desirable, potentially conflict with each other. So I'll also pause and ask whether any of them might conflict with these two principles. In addition, several of these kinds of constraints might operate well in normal times, but be more problematic in certain circumstances. So I'll end on whether there are times we might think transparent decision-making and opportunities for public comment to be more problematic. Starting with the positives, as I say, these two constraints operate pretty effectively as a pair. First, government should have to explain what it's planning to do and why. Then, once it's done so, there should be chances for others to express their views publicly, including criticising the government's proposals and suggesting alternative ideas. One way of considering the merits of these constraints is thinking about what life would be like if they weren't there. On the first point, if government made policy in secret and just pursued changes without bothering to justify them, I think we would all see that in normal times as pretty problematic in a democracy. But why would that be a problem? I think there are several reasons. First, democracy requires accountability. If we elect a government, we need to be able to judge whether it's making the right decisions, partly in order to know whether it deserves to remain in power. How could we judge the government at the next election if it hadn't been open up with us about what it was doing? Second, obviously, the decisions that government takes can profoundly affect our everyday lives. That may involve changing provision of public services like the NHS or education, having economic effects like raising taxes or introducing new criminal offences. We need to know what the government's doing because it could have serious effects on us, our families and communities as citizens. If we didn't know that a new criminal offence was being introduced, we might inadvertently break the law. If we didn't know that tax changes were coming, we couldn't plan our spending. Notably, making policy in secret without offering adequate explanations could have negative effects on other principles expressed on the slide as well, particularly E and F. Without transparency, it would be hard to know whether policymakers were following good standards of behaviour. It would also be hard to know if policies were having an unfair effect on certain groups. For all these reasons, transparency seems straightforwardly a good idea. And once you've agreed that policy decisions should be publicly explained, you open up the possibility of respecting the other principle, that they're open to public comment and criticism. Again, imagine that this wasn't the case. Announcements are made, but nobody can speak out against them. That wouldn't feel like a democracy. So there are principled reasons of free speech to support public opportunities to comment on government's action and propose alternative policy options. But this isn't just a matter of principle, it's a question of good practical politics as well. Once a policy decision is opened up to comment, people may point out problems that the government hadn't thought about. None of us are perfect, politicians included, and we can all make mistakes. Policy is complicated and can have unintended effects. Perhaps the economic impact of a new policy on certain groups, or the environmental impact, or the interaction with other policies hasn't been properly considered. Perhaps there are other places that have tried a similar policy from which we could learn. By opening policy decisions to comment, we increase the chances that any flaws are pointed out in advance, and we get better policy as a result. But the benefits of openness and opportunities for public criticism go further than this. If the government knows it's going to be subject to public scrutiny, that it's going to have to explain itself and answer difficult questions, This encourages it to think through and critique its own policy much better in advance. No government wants to be embarrassed or forced into U-turns, and knowing that policy will be carefully examined means it actively works to avoid making mistakes. This kind of public examination, as I say, goes on every day in Parliament. It's a key reason why it's important in a democracy, not only to have a government, but also in opposition, a set of qualified politicians prepared to ask difficult questions. It's also a reason why it's important to have a free media and a vibrant community of pressure groups and other experts who can comment on policy. So there are lots of reasons to value these principles of openness and accountability. But are there also downsides? I'm sure this is something you'll want to discuss. In terms of the other principles expressed on the slide, I suggested that openness is good for E and F, promoting protection of rights and ensuring that politicians act within the rules. It's also in line with D, ensuring that policy isn't just imposed by a narrow minority, but is as far as possible consistent with the broader public interest. It's a bit more problematic for C, ensuring that politicians stick with their manifesto pledges. Manifestos are public documents, so clearly in line with the first principle I'm defending of transparency about your policy plans. But subjecting manifesto proposals to scrutiny after an election before they're implemented, for example in Parliament, could result in questions being asked that lead to a change of direction. Closer examination could suggest that a manifesto proposal was unrealistic. So there are some difficult tensions between different kinds of accountability here. Finally, are there special circumstances when we might think it defensible to ignore either of these two principles and remove these kinds of constraints? It feels like these are limited, but there may be special cases. In terms of secret policy making, these would be narrower, but might apply, for example, in times of war with respect to military decisions. In terms of ability for public criticism, there might sometimes be timing constraints, and generally there may be limits on how much we want to slow the policy process down. Notably, some of the COVID decisions taken by the government were announced at very short notice in an attempt to keep us safe. But even at times such as this, there are arguments that powers given to governments without proper oversight should be temporary, with requirements for scrutiny afterwards and the possibility of reversal. I'm sure you'll want to consider some of these kinds of limits on the constraints, as well as the merits of the constraints themselves in your groups. And now I'll hand back to Kayla.